Hi everyone, and welcome for this video where I'll speak about Nutanix on AWS and especially about the network part. So NC2 is a Nutanix Cloud Cluster, and it's a way to deploy Nutanix on top of cloud provider. And in that case, on AWS, there is a lot of things to know about the networking. So the purpose of this video is to just have a deep dive on what is mandatory and what are the objects, the network objects that we will use in the case of NC2 and AWS. So to start, everything start like every other workload on AWS with a VPC, a virtual private cloud, that is a boundary, a network boundary in AWS. So in the case of NC2 and AWS, we need at least one VPC with a CIDR range between /16 and /23. And most of the times we will use the private range, and the minimum value, so the recommended value is /23. If you are deploying your cluster through the NC2 portal, that is also named MCM, Multi-Cloud Management Portal, and you can ask the portal to create for you the VPC, a /23 will be used. If you create by yourself outside of the MCM portal, the VPC, you can maybe use a 20/24, need to be confirmed. But in the documentation of Nutanix, the range should be between 16 and 23, and that's right here. So I recommend you to keep in these limits and not try anything else that is undocumented. Please do not use the 192.168.5.0/24 CIDR, because this CIDR is used internally for the communication between the CVM, the controller VM, and the installer hypervisor, that is AHV by default in NC2 and AWS. Also, if you are deploying by yourself the VPC before deploying the cluster, think about also enable the DNS attribute of the VPC, and there is two attributes that are available here, that is for using the DNS of AWS and also doing the resolving inside the VPC. So don't forget to check these two options of the VPC. You can use VPC endpoint also, we will see later, but VPC endpoint are useful when you want to optimize your network traffic, especially when you are writing or reading things on, for example, an S3 bucket. It's cheaper to use the VPC endpoint because VPC endpoints, the communication will be internally and will not go through a NAT gateway or a firewall or anything else. So we are using in NC2, we are using two kind of VPC endpoints, the S3 and the EC2, especially for having access to the metadata. So you can deploy a gateway endpoint for S3 or an EC2 endpoint, an interface endpoint. It can be useful if you want to optimize the cost of your network traffic. So inside the VPC, we have also some subnet, of course. And so we need at least a public subnet with a CIDR between /16 and /25. And by default, again, if it's the network is created in the process of deployment of the cluster through the NCM portal, the default CIDR will be a /28. It's very important to remember that in Nutanix Cloud Cluster, we need to have a communication between the bare metal, the node, and internet, especially the NCM portal. So there is many ways to do that. By default, if you let the wizard deploying everything for you, we will deploy a public subnet with a NAT gateway and an Ethernet gateway. So it's very, very classic inside AWS networking. But most of the times, if you are a company, you will probably have already in place in AWS a network virtual appliance firewall. So by default, we are deploying a NAT gateway, an internet gateway, and we are deploying a public subnet. But if you already have in place a landing zone, maybe a transit gateway with a central VPC for going out with a network appliance. In that case, you don't need to deploy this public subnet. There is also an option to use a proxy. If you have a version of AWS that is higher than 6.7.1.6, you can use the proxy option, and in that case, all the internet communication will go through the proxy, and we'll go through the proxy when we are deploying the proxy, this parameter. So enable a proxy, you put the IP address of your proxy, the port, and if your proxy required authentication, you can also fill the information here. We can do that at the deployment of the cluster. We can do that after the deployment of the cluster. Things to remember, and we will see that later. Using the proxy means using also and need the VPC endpoint. So public subnet, the public access is mandatory. The public subnet by itself, it's not mandatory. It can be already, you can have an outbound access that is already available, and you can use it using the good routing, of course. So what subnet will be mandatory in the case of NC2 and AWS is a private management subnet for the cluster. It's where the hypervisor, ISG, and the controller VM, the CVM, will be running on top of EC2 metal instance. So the range will be between /16 and /25. The sizing, of course, will depend on the number of nodes you want to deploy in your cluster, or the number of clusters if you want to deploy all the clusters nodes inside the same subnet. By default, the CIDR is /25 if you are creating all the network through the wizard. And a /25 is enough for a 28 node cluster. That is currently the maximum number of nodes inside an NC2 and AWS cluster. The private subnet can be shared across multiple clusters for centralized management. So that's why you have the options to have a bigger CIDR to put additional nodes, so multiple cluster bare metal inside the same subnet. You will have for your user VM, so basically the workload, the virtual machine running on top of Nutanix AHV, you will have one or more private UVM subnet. So the range will be between /16 and /25. And it will be dedicated for for hosting the user VM. So all the VM running on top of AHV will be connected through this private UVM subnet. The number here, the CIDR, will really depend on the number of VM you want to deploy. If you have few VM, a small CIDR will be enough. If you plan to have a lot of VMs, think about it before. It's always complicated to change things later. Remember that in a subnet, AWS subnet, you can't assign the four first IP address and the last address, of course, of the subnets, because they are reserved by AWS. So think about it when you know your number of VMs and you want to do a very small subnet. If you are deploying your cluster NC2 with the flow of virtual networking, that is the Nutanix SDN, think about also that we need a subnet for Prisma Central, because flow networking is managed by Prisma Central. So Prisma Central will be deployed on a dedicated subnet, and Prisma Central here is of course for the management and the orchestration, and it should be in a separate subnet. So the CIDR can be between /16 and /28. The default CIDR that is used if you are deploying automatically through the NC2 deployment without the cluster, the default will be /28. That is enough. And when you are using flow networking, in that case, you will need a special subnet for that. It will be called FVN, Flow Virtual Networking Subnet. And this subnet will be dedicated to a single cluster for flow networking, and it cannot be shared with other network. So remember that. The CIDR can be between /16 and /24. /24 should be enough. And it is a default CIDR that will be used by the NCM portal if you choose to deploy everything through the wizard. Of course, if you are deploying previously, and I think it's a recommendation to do that, to prepare the landing zone, the network landing zone of your cluster before deploying the cluster. So think about all these CIDR that are available here. One of the main reasons is you should deploy your VPC and subnet before using the NC2 portal, the NCM portal for deploying the cluster, is that everything that that is deployed by the MCM portal will be also destroyed if you destroy the cluster. So maybe you don't want to destroy your network after with your cluster. That's why I recommend also always to deploy the subnet and the VPC before deploying your cluster. The cluster will be running EC2 metal instance, and connected to this EC2 metal instance, you will have some elastic network interface. So they are attached to the metal instance, and there is one ENI that is needed for HV and the CVM. So the first ENI attached will be for the hypervisor and the controller VM, and there will be at least 2 IP addresses on that elastic network interface. 1 to 14 additional elastic network interface will be added depending on the number of UVM you have. So currently 14 is the maximum, so you have at maximum 15 ENI per metal instance. It's true for all the actual metal instance available in AWS. New metal instance with more attachment possible will be available. And inside the Nutanix Cloud Cluster, there is a cloud network controller that will manage all the attachment and the creation of your elastic network interface. So, for example, when you are starting with a brand new cluster that is almost empty, with no VM running internally, the first UVM you will create will need, of course, an ENI, and the network controller will deploy for you automatically the ENI. The network controller also is responsible for attaching the right security group to the ENI, and we will see that later. So for the MTU, the maximum transfer unit by default on all interface, it's 1,500 bytes. But when you are using flow networking, you have to remember that we are doing encapsulation, and basically we are putting IP packets on top of IP network. So the system will advertise MTU for 1,442 bytes to UVM. So the extra 58 bytes are used by the protocol that we are using for the encapsulation, for doing the overlay on top of the AWS subnet, and it's Geneva, and it's 58 byte. So we recommend to change the MTU for all the network interface when you are using Flow virtual networking. As I said, when we are deploying a cluster or after deploying a cluster, we can choose to use a proxy servers for all the communication between the nodes and Prisma Central and the control plane that is the Nutanix multi-cloud management portal. So we can use a proxy, and if we are using a proxy, we need a VPC endpoint, and we need these 2 VPC endpoints, the S3 and the EC2. So now a very important part about the networking in AWS when we are using NC2 is the security group of AWS. So as you know, so we are using massively the AWS security group, and so you know that the network security group, the AWS security group, are composed of inbound and outbound rules. It's only rules that allow traffic. There is no deny in AWS. And also in these rules, if you are looking in detail on the rules that we are deploying for you, you will see some security group referencing. So when we are using a referencing, that means we can use as a source another security group. So meaning we are referencing all the resources that are attached to another security group. So just have a look about that if you don't know the way we are using the security group referencing. So yeah, the rule affects all the instances that are associated with a security group. So if in the security group B, you are referencing the security group A, all the instances associated with the security group A will be handled in this rule. That's all. So by default, when we are deploying a cluster on NC2 on AWS, some security group, AWS security group, will be created for each cluster. So there is a bunch of. So the first rule will be so the first security group created by default is the internal management group. So this rule is important for controlling the communication between HV and the CVM within a cluster. So our recommendation is not trying to modify manually. Manually means through the UI of the AWS console or through the CLI. Don't try to modify the security group. You're not supposed to do that. And this security group is associated with the ENE of the management subnet. The second security group in AWS that is created is the user management. So the user management, it's really for controlling the UVM to the CVM communication and all the external communication administration with other cluster and so on. This rule also includes everything about Prism element and all the additional services like the replication, the data use, and we are controlling everything. Every rule there is already created for you, so you are not supposed to modify again manually the security group through the AWS console. The good thing to know is all these things, so the user management and the internal management, it can be set up also during our Flutter NC2 deployment, and it will be directly inside. So when you are going in the deployment of the cluster, you will have an access policy area where you will define some restriction, or you can, by default, it will be disabled. So if you are doing some restrictions, say for example, all the IP address of my internal network of my on-prem is allowed to connect to the Prism element, or is allowed to connect, for example, to SSH, you can define that here. So you put the right IP address or IP range, and automatically it will update the security group on AWS. So this is where, when you are deploying the cluster, and after the deployment of the cluster inside the NC2, the NCM, the MCM portal, you will get access also to the access policy, and you can change that later. Also here, there is an area that is public. When you are clicking on public and selecting public, automatically that means the portals will deploy for you an AWS load balancer with an IP, an external IP, and will create also the good rule in the security group. And by this way, you can access directly from Ethernet to your Prism element. So remember, we can control all this. So the access to Prism element and all the access to the management service, SSH, Move, Prism Essential, directly through the UI of the NC2 portals. So our recommendation is not trying to modify this security group directly in the AWS console. So internal management and user management are created by default. One is for the cluster, one is for the management. And the third rule that will be created will be the UVM. So the UVM security group will be there for controlling the external traffic, so that is entering or leaving the UVM. So the security group will be directly associated with the ENI that are associated with the UVM subnet. And that's important to remember that you should not, you must not trying to attach directly some security group to the UNI. Everything is done automatically by the cloud controller. So don't try to do some things manually, especially on that. The UNI that are associated with the UVM subnet will be this one, the BR0 overlay, the BR overlay, bridge overlay 0, and the nonat in case of you are using the flow virtual networking. So if you are going in your Prism element console and going to the hardware and the network, you will see at least three UNI, and you will know the name of this UNI and which one is associated to the user VM subnet. Also, what's important to notice is that we have some associate tags that are available for each security group, and you will find some tags about with key about the cluster, with the cluster UID and the value of the UID of the cluster. Just remember that this UID is also available in the summary page of the Nutanix Cloud Cluster portal. It's where you can manage everything. And you have a special key here, this value all UVM. So in that case, you will know that the security group is dedicated for UVM. In the case of Prism Central, so if you have chosen to deploy your NC2 cluster on AWS with flow networking, in that case, it will deploy automatically for you a Prism Central, and this Prism Central has also its own security group, and it will be attached to the UNI that is associated for Flow Virtual Network Subnet. So it will be a br0.uvm for the name of the UNI. So by default, between 1 to 3 rules that will be available for you, security group, sorry. There is also the options to create your own custom security group. And in that case, it's supported only if you have an iOS 6.7 or later versions. And it's only available if you are using the EHV native network integration. So remember, there is 2 options for the network, the NC2 AWS networking option. First one, the historical one, is the EHV native network integration. And basically, you are binding the subnet on AWS with a subnet inside iOS, and the IPAM is the IPAM of AWS. And in that case, you are not using the flow networking. Option number 2 is you are using flow networking. So remember that the AWS custom security group are available and can be used only if you have running the EHV native network integrations. So it doesn't apply if you are using flow virtual networking. And it can be applied at different level. It can be, the security group can be applied at the VPC level, the network level, or the cluster level. And you have also to configure the Prism Central security group and all the UVM in a way that you can have a communication between the Prism Central and the UVM. Of course, if you're using Prism Central, you know that sometimes you need a communication between this server and your user virtual machine. By default, in AWS, there is a service quota that allows you to create only a maximum of 5 custom security group per ENI. And you have also the list of port and requirements that is here. So important to remember is how you can select if a security group will apply to the VPC level, the network level, or the cluster levels. It will really depend on some tags, simply. So, for example, if you want to deploy to have a security group that will apply on the whole VPC level, in that case, you have to put this tag for the security group, tag Nutanix, the cluster externals. If you want to apply just at the cluster level, in that case, you will create 2 tags. One that is the same as previously see, and the other one, there is a tag where you will put your cluster ID. And if you want to do that at the network level, so especially for a special network, you will add a third tags. So remember, don't try to attach some security group to the ENI. It will be done automatically for you by the network controller, that is the cloud network controller that is running inside the Nutanix Cloud Cluster. And this network controller will read all these tags and will affect correctly the security group to the right UNI. Load balancing, so it's very simple. First thing is, if you want to allow an access to Prisma Central or Prisma element to the CVM. So for the Prisma element, it's very simple. You can do that directly using the access policy in the MCM portal, the NC2 portal. And it's just an option to select that is public, and it will create for you the load balancer and manage all the security group. And if you want to access through an AWS load balancer to your Prisma Central, then you will have to create by yourself the load balancer and also change the security group for Prisma Central. Also, you can use some load balancing option in AWS to access the workloads that are running in your user VM. For the routing, so you will be, so if you are deploying the network with the cluster, so using the NC2 portals to do all the job, including creating the VPC and the subnet, in that case, you will get a public subnet with a public route table. The public route table will say to go to 0.0.0, go through the internet gateway. And it will create also for you some private subnet with a local private local route table. And this route table for going to 0.0.0, so outside the internet, go through the NAT gateway that is running in the public subnet. So, as I said, this it's recommended to create by yourself all your VPC and network, and probably if you already have a network architecture, you already have some outgoing access solution like a firewall, for example. So this public routing table in that case is not important because it's already done previously in your network. So if you have already your firewall, your gateway that is in another VPC, then probably you will have simply a transit gateway between the VPC that is used by Nutanix to the VPC that has the internet access. So in that case, it will be just a local route, so that is attached to all the subnets that are private. And in that case, there is probably a route to the transit gateway to go to the other VPC. That's all. Last thing that is very important is all about the port and the endpoint requirement, especially if you are using some firewall or proxy. You want to control where the communication are going. And it's always a question when we want to deploy an NC2 cluster, all the customer ask for that. So we have a list of all the port and endpoint requirement. So everything is listed here. So you have the destination, the protocol, why we need that. So for example, the NC2 portals, we need to connect to that. So we have URL for the licensing, for downloading, and so on. You have also all the cluster outbound to NC2 and some additional requirement. So the list, it's a big list, but you have to check that. It's very important. And if you are deploying Prisma Central through the automated installation, in the case of you are selecting Flow virtual networking, you have to open also some communication to the CDN of AWS as a CloudFront. Because we are using some CDN in front of our URLs. And especially if you are deploying Prisma Central, we are downloading a big tar file that contains the image of Prisma Central. And sometimes we have some customers that are blocking this extension or the size of the file also. So it's two reasons why sometimes the deployment of Prisma Central can fail during an automated installation. It's because there is a network device that is filtering everything that. So you can check depending on this blocking feature on your firewall. There is it's non-full complete list, but it's the most common firewall we can see in the field. And please have a look about this file blocking option that are very well appreciated by the security guy and less appreciated by people that are trying to deploy things. Also, when we are deploying a cluster with Flow virtual networking, we have a CMSP, that is the microservice, the cloud microservice platform. So it's a set of component, and in this component you have the network controller. And these components, they need also to have some outgoing traffic. So the list is here, and you see, for example, that we need some access to an Elastic Container Registry. It's where we are putting the image of the controller service. So everything, all this traffic must be open also. So it's a big list, but it's very well referenced, and you have all the information about why we need that. And I think it's the end of the video. So we spent a lot of time on that, but it's very important to understand the different components of the networking, especially if you are doing a Nutanix Cloud Cluster and AWS, because most of the issues are coming from bad configuration of the network or missing part in the firewall or things like that. So I hope this video was useful for you, and see you later. Bye.